Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Hollandbird. I am the Special Projects Coordinator at Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas. And I'm really happy to be with you all today. Thank you so much for joining us. Later, we'll be joined by Vicki Nielsen from the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, who will be talking a little bit about proposed regulations on asylum. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Our staff member, Diego Adame, is on the line and he'll be reading the questions later on. So don't be surprised if you see him pop up a little later. So I wanted to cover three main topics today. Obviously, the world has changed dramatically in the last few months, and that's certainly true here at the border. We've seen really too much change to really process and internalize. But there's really been a concerted plan and a continuous plan at the border to end asylum and to end all immigration. So today I'll be going over the impact of Title 42 expulsions, which is a policy where anyone who crosses the border is immediately sent back, no matter their circumstances. I'll be covering the spread of COVID-19 in ICE detention and how the virus is then exported to other countries through deportation. And then I'll be giving some updates on the situation of migrants living in Juárez. So, like I said, we've really seen a plan since day one of the Trump administration to end the asylum program completely, and also to end all immigration generally, to end the immigration of non-white people into the US, using the architecture that already existed previously under previous administrations, the tools of militarization and deterrence that were already in motion, that were already, very much foundational to this administration's ability to now do everything that it's doing. But we've seen that the pandemic has been immediately seized on as a tool to finalize the plan that's been in place since the beginning. So even though we've seen this vast series of changes, it's all kind of stayed the same in a way, and it's hastened what was already in the works. So instead of, allowing people to have a chance at a better life or investing in some of the root causes that are causing people to migrate, this administration is making it so incredibly difficult to seek asylum or to migrate that people simply give up. And we see that these policies are illegal, they're inhumane, and they're repeatedly knocked down in court because they're just sort of blatantly wrong and illegal. But the bar for normality and sanity has shifted so quickly that the most outrageous things that we, even a year ago, we would have never thought could happen are now a daily reality. So I really wanted to, make the point that there's this through line of attempting to end asylum, attempting to end immigration, and the pandemic has just provided more opportunities for that to happen. So the changes that I'm going to go through today are all being proposed in the name of public health. But I think from seeing everything through a wide lens, we'll see that these policies are very inconsistent and that there's really ultimately no public health basis to them. All right. So one of the most confusing and unprecedented moves that's been made is to begin turning people back at the border. So, the administration is taking advantage of the confusion, the fear that we all feel around this pandemic to essentially end asylum at the border while our attention is elsewhere. So right now there is no asylum. It's been halted. We don't know when it'll start again. So in March, the CDC and DHS issued an order that uses Title 42 of the US Code, which is a public health law, to immediately expel anyone who arrives at the border. So anyone who crosses between a port of entry, crosses at the ports of entry, and the order makes it very clear that this is aimed at people who would be held in a holding facility, people who would be taken into custody and held in those border, like border sites that we've heard so much about, the holding facilities that are crowded and where people don't have, even room to sit down. That was before. So now everyone is being turned back, and that order has been extended indefinitely until COVID-19 ceases to be a threat, which it's going to continue to be for the foreseeable future. So these expulsions, this order empowers DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, to expel anyone who is crossing and would be held in one of these holding facilities. So there have been about 109,621 expulsions from March through July. And if you read our report, you probably saw that there was, the last number we stated, which was from March through June, was 72,000. And then the July numbers came out after we had published. So now we're at about 109,621 expulsions. There's been a steady increase in migration as economic conditions in sending countries worsen. So we had 15,000 expulsions in April, and then we had 35,000 in July. And one important thing to note is that the number of expulsions is not the same as the number of people expelled, because one person can actually be expelled multiple times. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So the order was actually issued under the authority of the CDC. So it's weaponizing a public health agency in furtherance of a very explicitly political goal. And the real damage here is to people who are being expelled in violation of their human rights, but it's also really bad for the public health response. The CDC has, the question of how they've handled this pandemic is its own kind of, discussion, but right now is the time when we most need people to trust institutions and to trust that the guidance that they're giving is correct. So the fact that we're using the lead public health agency to do something in blatant violation of human rights is really dangerous, and it might make people distrust their motives in the future. So what exactly does the expulsion process look like? Expulsion is a kind of a new phenomenon that is distinct from deportation. So with deportation, even though it's very cruel, very arbitrary, there's a kind of process, there's a judge, there's a paper trail. But with an expulsion, when someone crosses the border, they're apprehended by Border Patrol. The line agents are making an on-the-spot determination about whether each person should be expelled. And this is a decision that's usually made by a trained asylum officer, by an immigration judge. Border Patrol agents are just not given the training. They're not, their jobs were not created to make these kinds of determinations. And we've seen, over and over at the border that they have kind of a siege mentality, that they're defending the border against an invasion. So they're not equipped to handle vulnerable people who are coming from a situation of trauma, who might be in physical or medical distress. These agents are making a life and death decision for this person while also trying to protect themselves and others from COVID-19. So it's kind of a perfect storm. And it's a huge burden to place on these agents as well. We've seen that they keep being placed in positions that they're not really equipped for, that they're not giving the training and the resources for, from family separation to caring for young children in custody. So then when someone is apprehended by Border Patrol, they're essentially taken to a port of entry and told to walk south into Mexico. There are supposed to be exemptions for vulnerable populations, but it really doesn't appear, that doesn't really appear to be happening. because the order is not about protecting people. It's about ending asylum. It's about prohibiting people from entering the country. And so what we see is situations like an 8 months pregnant woman being, traveling alone, crosses the border, and then is then told to walk into Juárez alone, having no resources, no connections, no, knowledge of Juárez. And then, the same, we talk a lot about people in the Remain in Mexico program and the kind of factors that exist for them, where they're being sent into an environment that they're unfamiliar with. They're vulnerable, and those environments are, have a lot of predatory actors who are preying on migrants. Those same factors are going to exist for people who are being rapidly expelled. And once they're sent back, we really don't know what happens to them, and they're kind of stranded. But the Title 42 order actually incentivizes people to attempt multiple crossings. So because people are being turned back so quickly, where usually they would be held in detention for long periods of time. So because they're just being, sent back in this continuous loop, there's less risk legally to crossing multiple times, even though that's going to mean being in the hands of a coyote, crossing in the desert at the height of the summer, which is very dangerous. But if you're desperate to get into the US because you're fleeing a situation of violence, or your country is just breaking down economically, it's kind of rational to just try as many times as you can. And so this policy is incentivizing that, and pushing people into more dangerous crossing areas. So we know the coyotes are doing great business right now because people just want to keep trying. So when the pandemic started, there was kind of a slowdown in migration, like a global pause. And there was a huge drop in the number of apprehensions and expulsions in April at the southern border. But since then, the numbers have been climbing steadily. So as I mentioned earlier, we went from around 15,000 in April to more than 35,000 expulsions in July. That's way lower than the crossing numbers that we saw last year. So July 2019, we saw like 72,000 apprehensions just in that month. So the numbers are really down from where they were, but it's still significant that we're seeing an increased numbers of migration right now, because we know that countries in Latin America are really struggling economically, and that people are falling into poverty and unable to work. And it's likely that as the pandemic continues to wear on, the economies continue to contract, we're going to see further surges. The majority of crossers right now are from Mexico, which is the inverse of what we've been seeing for a long time. So at the height of the surge in 2019, most people arriving were Central American families, and Mexican migration was not as common. But now we're seeing more and more Mexican adults, single adults, as well as families and unaccompanied minors migrating as the economy is tanked. And the reforms that AMLO has promised, which are largely based on lifting the economy, have not borne a lot of fruit. So this will be interesting to observe, to see, as the Mexican government has been an integral element of Trump's migration policy. They cooperate with MPP, receiving people on Mexican territory. They've reinforced their own southern border with Guatemala, detaining and deporting people en route to the US. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Mexican government reacts to now increasing Mexican migration and the rights of their own people being violated, even as they kind of partner with the Trump administration in these policies. So one of the most awful aspects of these Title 42 expulsions are the expulsions of children. And I think, history is going to look back on us and see that this is one of the lowest points we've ever sunk to. We don't have the actual numbers of children being turned back because CBP, Customs and Border Protection, doesn't release those numbers. But we know that it's now in the thousands. For example, in June, 1,500 children were encountered at the border. So an encounter is when they cross the border and they make contact with Border Patrol. So an encounter could mean that they're taken into custody, or it could mean an expulsion. That term encounter is kind of a new term. So in the month of June 2020, 1,500 children approximately were encountered at the border. Only 61 were referred to a shelter. So 1,500, and then 61 of those kids are taken to a shelter, which tells us that most likely, we can't know for sure, but most likely the rest of those 1,500 children were turned away and expelled. And this is illegal. This is illegal. There's very little transparency or accountability for how these children are treated, what happens to them. But what happens with children, whereas adults are just sent back into Mexico, children are briefly taken into custody. We've seen lots of stories about how they're held at hotels at the border under the care of a private contractor, which puts them into a black box where they can't contact attorneys or family, and there's not a lot of information about how they're being treated. And from there, they're sent back to their home country by plane. So held in these hotels, sent back. Sometimes their families aren't notified of where they are, that they've been sent back, that they're even in the US. And a story by the Texas Tribune and ProPublica found that children are actually being tested for COVID before they're expelled. And they're only put on the plane if they test negative. So if you had a child who tested negative for COVID-19, you could easily release that child to a shelter and then reunite them with family. So this is one of those things that shows us very clearly this is not about public health. Under an anti-trafficking law that was passed actually under the Bush administration in 2008, unaccompanied children who cross the border are supposed to be transferred from the custody of the Border Patrol to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. There's an established process where Border Patrol is supposed to transfer the child to ORR, Refugee Resettlement Office. Then ORR places that child in a shelter that has to operate under certain standards, has to be licensed until the child's sponsors in the US can be identified and screened, and then the child can be placed with the sponsor. And this law was explicitly designed by Congress to prevent children from being trafficked and to ensure that they're not being held in a law enforcement setting. So what the Trump administration is doing is directly in violation of the law and of the intent of Congress. And a judge actually halted the expulsion of a young 16-year-old boy from Honduras. He was represented by the ACLU and Las Americas of El Paso. The judge found that the practice of expelling children is likely illegal and exceeds the authority of the CDC, but the ruling only applied to the boy in question, and it didn't apply to the entire class of children being expelled. So we're going to move into the section on ICE detention and deportation. But if you have any questions, please drop those into the chat. This slide shows the number of apprehensions per month in the El Paso sector. So this is not the number of expulsions, but this is the number of apprehensions, which is where someone is taken into custody. So we see kind of a steady increase from March through July. So even while the Border Patrol is expelling people, based on this Title 42 order, which says, people could introduce COVID-19 into the US if we allow them to come in and seek asylum. So that's the whole premise of that practice of expulsion. And then on the other hand, you have ICE, which is directly facilitating the spread of the virus and then exporting it to other countries. One thing that we know now is that people who are indoors with each other for a prolonged period of time are at heightened risk for coronavirus. So that's why we saw in China this very harsh practice of, and some would argue like a rights violating practice of taking infected people out of their homes and housing them with in gyms with other infected people until they could recover. And so even though that was kind of, a dubious practice, it actually appeared to work pretty well because, if you have sick people and you have healthy people in the same home, they're going to spread it to each other. So then we fast forward to when the virus starts to spread in the US. We know that we have an enormous population of detained people because we rely on incarceration so much. So we have people in prisons, we have people in immigration detention, and we know that this is going to be a major source of spread. It's especially dangerous because in immigration detention, we know that there are routine human rights violations, that medical care is extremely poor quality, it's very limited, it's crowded. And then we know that you have guards and contractors, attorneys, judges, etc., moving in and out of the facilities on a daily basis. And then you have people who are housed very close together and, don't really have the resources, the medical resources that they need. So in El Paso, we have an ICE field office region, and that covers both El Paso and southern New Mexico. And we have these three facilities, Otero, El Paso Processing Center, and Torrance. And we have cases there. So as of today, there have been 170 cases at the El Paso Processing Center, which is right in the city. 13 of those cases are active currently. We've had 150 cases at Otero Processing Center in southern New Mexico and 55 cases at Torrance, which is also New Mexico. And none of those cases are active. There's also been one confirmed employee case at El Paso Processing Center. So people within the facilities have reported to their attorneys that they're being held in the same spaces with infected people and that they can't social distance. They don't have access to appropriate hygiene. So one woman in detention said that ICE's version of a quarantine is when they house people together in the same barracks, even if there are sick people inside the barracks. So a quarantine is supposed to mean that you take sick people out and you isolate them, or you isolate them together so that they don't infect healthy people. So instead, what ICE is doing is just taking people, like mixing sick people and healthy people inside a barracks and calling that a quarantine, which is going to guarantee that it spreads. Detained people say that they don't have adequate soap, they can't wash their hands. At the beginning, it seems like guards were not really wearing masks, detained people didn't have access to masks. And there's been very little transparency from ICE about how it's managing public health within these facilities, what exactly the practices and protocols are. And so it's very hard to know at any given moment exactly what's happening. So what should have been done was to immediately release people and work with community organizations like Annunciation House in El Paso to make sure that people can quarantine and then reunite with their family. Most people in immigration detention are there for a civil offense, and they don't have a factor that would make them in any way dangerous or a risk to the community. And then ICE is also deporting people. So this report by the New York Times and the Marshall Project found that more than 40,000 people have been deported since March. And I'm sure that number has grown since then. 60% of these deportation flights have been to Central America, but 11 countries in total have confirmed that they have COVID-19 cases that originated from a deportation flight. So in Guatemala, for example, in April, the president said, 20% of our cases are coming from these deportation flights, and we just don't have the capacity to handle this. So it's a really serious problem. Like at the same time as the US State Department is telling citizens not to travel abroad, we're also deporting people to countries that don't have the medical infrastructure to handle a huge outbreak. So actually there's this organization, Witness at the Border. They compile weekly statistics on ICE deportations. The week of August 8th, so this last week, there were 17 total deportation flights to 6 different countries: Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Haiti. And, they just don't have the capacity to handle this. So some of our partners in Central America that we work with have said that there's increasing deaths of healthcare workers in these facilities, and they don't have the equipment, they don't have the resources they need to manage this. And they've begged the US not to continue deporting people, or to at least do improved screening before people are deported. There appears to be some screening, but we know that people can be asymptomatic. They could be pre-symptomatic, and a symptom check is not the same as having a COVID test. So even though screening is improved, people are still being deported while they're sick and then testing positive when they arrive in their home country, which is, people can spread it to their family and their community. There's a lot of stigma against people who are deported, especially now because they could be carrying the virus. So it's really an untenable situation. Here we have the current case numbers, over 4,000 in total across the nation in ICE facilities, 1,084 active and 4 people who've died. So really the solution should be to release people. And I would absolutely encourage you to check out Witness at the Border. They do great work. They compile information about these ICE flights. So now I'm going to move into talking a little bit about what's happening in Juárez with people in MPP, with people who are newly arriving. And I want to give a big shout out to Omar Rios. He is our Border Refugee Assistance Fund coordinator. The fund was set up by Bishop Mark Seitz at El Paso last year in conjunction with Hope. And we raised money to be able to contribute to work being done in Juárez to assist migrants and to make sure that we're contributing to structural change and support. So Omar is our coordinator for that. He's been doing an amazing job making sure that the funding is getting where it's needed the most. And he was also really, really instrumental in crafting this report and in getting us data and information about what's happening in Juárez. So thank you so much, Omar. So we know that there are approximately 2,000 people, 2,000 migrants living in Juárez, but the number is likely much higher. That's just a rough estimate. Many people, many migrants living in Juárez are in the Remain in Mexico program. So they came in, applied for asylum, and then were sent back to Juárez and sort of put in this process where they come into the US for their court date and then they're sent back. So a lot of people in that program were able to find jobs in maquiladoras, in restaurants, bars, stores, selling things in the informal sector. And they were able to rent apartments or stay in hotels. So a lot of people in the program, including Central Americans and Cubans, were able to attain a kind of stability, even though they were facing many challenges from being forced to live in Juárez rather than being able to be paroled into the US to reunite with family. So there was a degree of stability. People were able to sort of, afford private housing and continue showing up to their court dates. There's also a population of people that we just don't know what's happened to them. So we know that there are these people who are working, have decided to kind of settle and work it out in Juárez. And then there's also a lot of people who have returned home or have just disappeared and we don't know what happens to them. Over 55% of people in the MPP program in Juárez did not show up to their last court date, which means that we just really don't know where they are or what's happened to them. So then when the pandemic started, it threw a huge wrench into a situation that was already pretty chaotic. The state of Chihuahua got ahead of the federal government a little bit and closed businesses and public spaces, canceled all the large events in late March. So that when that happened, similar to what happened in the US, a lot of migrants lost their jobs. And as a result, were no longer able to pay for housing. So that stability is kind of immediately undercut. And then at the same time, their MPP court hearings in El Paso were postponed beginning on March 23rd. And those postponements have been repeatedly renewed since then. And what DHS was doing is was asking people to come to the ports of entry in person to pick up these tear sheets, which were like little sheets of paper that had a new court date. So they had to go to the port of entry. The whole family had to go in person, which sort of, contradicts the whole point of the postponements, which is to avoid having people leave their homes and avoid, people having to be out in person. And thankfully, since then, that practice is no longer in place, due in some part to the advocacy of attorneys and organizations who, said this just doesn't make sense. So those MPP court hearings were postponed, and that was really devastating for people because there's no sense of continuity with their case. There's no one knows when it's going to start up again. DHS did issue guidelines recently that Mexico and the border states would have to meet before the hearings can restart, but we're a long way from that. And knowing this administration, it's not likely that they're going to resume hearings in good faith when it's safe to do so. Most people in MPP do not have lawyers, so it's really hard for them to get accurate information about what's happening, and there's just tremendous uncertainty and devastation from not being able to move forward with their case. There's also new arrivals who are coming into Juárez and facing the complete shutdown of the border and Title 42 expulsions. So when the pandemic started, the Juárez shelter network kind of shut down. They stopped taking in new residents in order to prevent contagion, limited residents' ability to come and go. So a filter hotel was set up to take in people who had just arrived at the border and quarantine them for 2 weeks, and then make sure that they could go to another shelter or go to a private housing or what have you. So the need for emergency services has increased because of the pandemic. There have been confirmed cases of COVID at the Filter Hotel and at this large government-run shelter in Juárez. But in the broader shelter network, many of them run by Christian organizations or just private individuals running these small shelters, it's really hard to know if there are outbreaks with residents at those shelters or outbreaks of migrants in private housing. Outbreaks of COVID among people who are living in Juárez and renting private housing. We know that there are about 1,100 people in the shelter network right now. So most people, being apprehended and expelled at the border currently are Mexican. So maybe people who are not going to be inclined to settle in Juárez and are attempting repeat crossings with the smugglers, as I mentioned, because the expulsion process is incentivizing this. But it's also incredibly dangerous because it's pushing people into the desert. And July was actually the hottest month on record for El Paso in our entire history. This month, or the month of July 2020, was the hottest month we've ever had. So really there's just been this incredible uncertainty and upheaval for people who were already struggling and who were already living in a situation of uncertainty and stress and trauma. So it's been a really, really difficult time for that. So what has Hope been up to in the last few months? Hopefully, or thankfully, we're all healthy. We're all doing well. And obviously our community is having a hard time. El Paso and Texas have continued to see cases go up, and there's been this really heartbreaking, job loss, economic hardship. A lot of households, over 26,000 households in El Paso, were left out of the CARES Act payments because they're undocumented or they're living in mixed status households. So one of the things that we have been working on is the Coalition for the Common Good, which is composed of local service providers, legal aid societies, philanthropies, local leaders, who are working with our local governments to ensure that there's help available for people in need. So that was kind of one of our first initiatives. It was really difficult. It was a big learning curve, but we were able to secure $2 million in direct cash assistance for people who were left out of the stimulus through the CARES Act. So that was huge. And there's this partnership between the city and the El Paso Community Foundation where families receive these preloaded debit cards. So these are people who didn't receive their $1,200 checks. So it's a big deal that they were able to receive some kind of assistance, even though it was not, it doesn't necessarily meet the whole need that's there. Other members of the coalition, like Project Bravo, have been instrumental in ensuring that other forms of aid that were enacted, like rental and utility assistance, are getting to where they need to go. I also mentioned the Border Refugee Assistance Fund. We've been continuing to work with Bishop Sites, with Omar, with our partners in Juárez on that. Many of you are supporters of this fund and you've contributed to it, so thank you so much for that. We're really proud of the impact it's having in Juárez. We've been able to support shelter infrastructure, so flood prevention, kitchens, washing rooms, heaters, gas tanks, mattresses. We've been able to do food distribution to families who are living maybe like out in private housing out in the city. We've also distributed more than 1,300 face masks to various organizations, shelters, worker rights organizations on both sides of the border. We also have one very special project that's supported by the fund. It's called Las Dadas, as in Las Embarazadas, the pregnant. So this project was started by local attorney Taylor Levy in partnership with VIA, which is an NGO we work with in Juárez. So Taylor, as I mentioned, people in NPP don't have good access to information. There's a lot of rumors about what's happening with the NPP program. It's very confusing. So Taylor has been going to the bridges regularly to talk to people, provide some legal advice, provide support and accurate information. And in the process of doing that, she realized that there were a number of pregnant women who were not getting the medical support that they needed. So she set up Las Dadas to make sure that these women could get regular medical checkups, prenatal care, that they could talk to a nurse midwife when they needed to, that they had access to specialists if they're high risk. A lot of the women in the program are Cuban, and they were in the Remain in Mexico program, or they are. Living in private housing, were working before the pandemic, but then were laid off. So, so they've been dealing with all of this, geopolitical change, a pandemic, all while being pregnant. And so this program is filling a really important need among this community and helping educate people in the program about COVID as well, giving them updates about court dates, Remain in Mexico. So this is a beautiful project, and it's one of the many reasons we're really proud of this fund and of the way it's been able to respond to the emerging needs among migrant communities in Juárez. So thank you to everyone who's contributed to that, who's supported it. So really quickly, before I hand it over to Vicki Nielsen from Clinic, wanted to talk a little bit about what we can expect to see in the next few months. Obviously, the election's coming up, and we can expect to see that the Trump administration is going to continue to ramp up attacks on border communities, attacks on migrants. Just recently, they proposed, or there's a draft of a new regulation that might be introduced that would prohibit the entry of US citizens and legal permanent residents if they are suspected of having the virus. Presumably a US citizen who goes over to Juárez to pick up medication and then tries to come back could be prohibited entry. So we'll be keeping track of this. we can, expect to see things continue to ramp up before the November elections. But what we'd like to ask you to do is to really organize yourselves, organize your faith community, organize your parish, organize your family, your neighbors, register to vote, make sure you know what the mail-in process is going to look like in your area, take the census, and just get organized, because we need your voice to be part of this. It's incredibly important. We'll also be, looking at what the Biden campaign is proposing in terms of immigration, what their plan looks like. We're involved in a wonderful root causes group with Faith in Action and grassroots partners in Central America that's looking at, what are the ways that we can address the root causes of migration from Central America and Mexico, like climate change, expropriation of lands. So this is a project we're working on to be able to, present something to an incoming administration. So we'll be taking a look at, what their migration plan and what their border communities plan looks like. So thank you all so much again for joining us. It's been an honor to share this report with you. And now I want to turn it over to Vicki Nielsen, the managing attorney for directly impacted populations at CLINIC, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, who are great partners of ours. So thank you so much for being with us, Vicki, and I will turn it over to you to talk about proposed asylum regulations.
First, I just want to thank you so much, Hope Hope Project, and Hannah and Diego, for everything that you do. I mean, it's such a challenging time to be working at the border, and there's so many obstacles and so much need. And as someone who is located in New York and pretty far away from everything that's happening at the border, I just really appreciate the day-to-day work that you're doing to support people who are in such difficult situations. So Hannah invited me to talk just briefly about some of the recent regulations that the administration has proposed that would really, unfortunately, change everything about asylum. I think there are people on the call who are not necessarily lawyers, so I just wanted to give a very brief overview. What's on your screen right now is the definition in the Immigration and Nationality Act of what a person needs to prove in order to win asylum. And basically, in the last 2 months, there have been 2 sets of regulations which would dramatically change what a person would need to show in order to be eligible to asylum, and that would also just impose a whole laundry list of new bars to winning asylum. So the language that's in red here are aspects of the asylum definition that this administration is trying to change through the regulation process, changing the legal standard if harm doesn't come directly from the government, changing the legal standard for some of the protected characteristics like political opinion, and particular social group, changing the legal standard for what persecution means and for what on account of means. So, as I said, there was one rulemaking that came out June 15th, 2020, which, this proposed rule was 161 pages in total and only gave the community 30 days to comment. And then following very closely on the heels of that, before that comment period had even closed, there was another proposed rule called the Asylum Security Regulation. So I'm going to talk first briefly about these quote unquote security regulations, because I think they're really closely related to the Section 42 expulsions, in that the administration is really using public health, quote unquote public health, as a pretext to end asylum, which is something they've been trying to do since the beginning of the administration. So this proposed rule, if it is published, and maybe just take a very quick step backward again for those who are not lawyers. I mean, basically we have the Immigration and Nationality Act, which, as Hannah pointed out, although that was passed in 1996, it really has a lot of very troubling provisions in it. And I think until this administration came into office, some of the worst aspects of that statute were not implemented. And now we're seeing it really being pushed to the limit of the most restrictive way it could possibly be read. And the executive branch has the power to issue regulations, and the regulations bind what the agencies can do. So in this case, the relevant agencies are DHS, which includes Customs and Border Protection at the border. It includes ICE, that does the detaining of people, ICE, that acts as the prosecutor in immigration court, and USCIS, that includes asylum officers as well as benefits adjudicators. And then we also have the Department of Justice, which is the agency in which the immigration court system is housed. So even though that sort of looks like a real court from the outside, it's really part of an agency and therefore governed by regulations, the same way that USCIS is. So this most recent regulation that's been proposed would add a security bar for anybody who's potentially been exposed to COVID. And what's really crazy about this is that it would situate this new bar to asylum and to withholding of removal within the section of the regulations that bars people from winning asylum because they are terrorists or because they have certain very serious crimes. So it's equating this public health pandemic that can hit anybody, and that there's really no wrongdoing in being exposed to COVID. It's situating it in this section of the law, which allows the United States to exclude people from the asylum system if they're potentially dangerous. And the language of this proposed regulation, again, is so sweeping, it's hard to imagine how it could even be enforceable. Basically, anyone who exhibits symptoms consistent with being afflicted with any contagious or infectious disease. So somebody could appear at the border and cough or have a fever, or the way it's written, although it seems from the context like this is primarily directed to keep people out at the border, the actual wording of the regulation doesn't say that it's limited to the border. So presumably a person could show up in immigration court in New York and, be coughing and sweating, and somehow an immigration judge is, empowered to make a decision that that person has symptoms consistent with a contagious or infectious disease, and therefore could be barred from asylum or withholding of removal, or has come into contact with such a disease. So, having been in an ICE detention facility could in and of itself make someone barred permanently under this new rule, or coming from a country or having embarked at a place where the disease is prevalent. So if the United States decides that the disease is prevalent in Mexico, for example, then anybody arriving at the border could be barred permanently from asylum or withholding of removal. Another aspect of this rule, which makes no sense, is, having a virus which runs its course and then people test negatively would end up giving somebody a permanent bar for either of these forms of relief. And, particularly troubling, these bars would be imposed at the credible fear stage. So again, somebody who presents at the border, says, I'm afraid to go back to my country of origin, if they exhibit signs of possibly having been exposed to a contagious disease, they could be barred without even getting to see an immigration judge. All that's left really to somebody who is potentially barred under these new rules would be deferral of removal under the Convention Against Torture, which is a very limited form of protection. Somebody has to show that they would be tortured in their country. But even with that, the United States would have the ability to not even hear their claim for CAT protection, and instead to just put them on an airplane somewhere to a country that would take them. So this, public health related regulation, as you can see, sweeps super broadly and could pretty much, as long as COVID-19 is the threat that it is today, would pretty much bar anybody from getting asylum or withholding of removal. And while, again, the regulations are written clearly in response to COVID, they're written broadly enough that they could remain in effect after COVID and be enforced as to any other serious sort of pandemic in the future. As I said, that comment period just ended Monday of this week. Basically, whenever there's a rulemaking, the agencies have to respond to comments that it received and go through, write up their responses, possibly edit the rule, and then publish an actual final rule. And generally, there's a 60-day period after the final rule is published before it goes into effect. But we could expect a final rule on this, basically at some point in the fall. I'm going to talk really quickly and probably not hit everything in these slides on the other asylum regulation, which came out earlier, which came out on June 15th, which again is just, it's really an effort by this administration to see any way that somebody's been able to succeed on an asylum application really in the past 3 years, particularly as the administration has been issuing Board of Immigration Appeals and Attorney General decisions to make it more difficult for people to win asylum. They're sort of using the regulatory practice to pull the rug out from any of those ways that people have succeeded. A couple of the things that are most troubling and very lengthy, dense, complex, troubling regulations. One is that immigration judges can look at the asylum application and decide whether or not they think the asylum seeker states a claim, whether there's enough there on the papers. And if there's not, then the judge doesn't even have to hold a hearing. They can just say, no, even if everything you said in here was true, you still wouldn't win. Therefore, we don't even have to give you a hearing. And in the context of the border, I think this is especially troubling. There's a new I-589 asylum application form that's been proposed that would increase the length of the form from 12 pages to 16 pages. Those additional 4 pages have very complicated legal questions about unlawful presence and whether foreign officials are acting under official capacity, et cetera. And the likelihood that someone who's unrepresented, as Hannah said, the vast majority of people in MPP are not represented, that anyone could fill out these forms in a way that would get them a hearing is quite slim. And likewise, again, just thinking specifically about the border, this new rule would change the legal standard or interpret the legal standard for credible fear interviews from what Congress intended to be as a very easy standard to meet, the significant possibility of succeeding in asylum. It's heightening that standard that the person would have to show a substantial and realistic possibility of succeeding. So they're really heightening that burden, again, with the effort to just keep people at the border, not let people come into the United States, and not even let them get a day in court.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was really, really helpful. So do you have time for a few questions?
Yes, sure.
Great. All right. So these are questions that were submitted through the chat. Federal judge issued an order a few weeks ago demanding that ICE release children from family detention centers. ICE has blatantly ignored that order, but we've heard some reports about one family that was released. Do you have any information about that? And Vicki, I don't know if you want to take this question since you are more involved with the legal aspect about the family detention issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a very clear answer to that question. I mean, you're talking about the Flores litigation, and I mean, for 30 years, there's been litigation about whether ICE has the ability to hold, to keep children in jail-like settings, and that there's been recent movement in that case, particularly given the context of COVID, that it's obviously unsafe to hold children in jails during COVID. And what's happened a lot from what I can see, and I'm not involved in that case, is the judge has good intentions and but she keeps giving the government a chance to do the right thing, and then the government never does the right thing. So, I mean, she has issued a couple of strong opinions saying, like, you have to release the children, and then the government doesn't. And then she says, no, the next time you really have to release the children, and then the government doesn't. So it seems like that pattern is happening again here. And I'm not sure what the answer is.
Yeah, and then there was that issue of binary choice where children, so the judge ordered that children be released, but her ruling didn't apply to their parents or like family members. So if they were detained together, presumably the family would have to make the decision to either be like release the child alone, so separate the family, or continue to have the child in detention with them, which is really bad for everyone. So has CDC weighed in at all on the public health aspect and the vulnerable population portion? Lots of CDC responses are being suppressed by the White House. So the Title 42 order was issued under CDC authority. I'm not sure, if they've really given any kind of follow-up to that. I don't imagine they would have a lot of freedom to do that. One thing that's interesting is they did, I believe last year they issued a bunch of regulations or guidelines to CBP about how to manage the spread of infectious diseases within border holding facilities. So they released all of these guidelines about how to stop the spread of influenza, because that's been a major problem. So we actually have like policies or protocols in place that if they were implemented, they could be used to keep people safe during the processing, during immigration processing, like at the border. So the guidelines are like face masks, have a sick ward or like an isolation unit, ensure that people can wash their hands, things like that. Is there the issue of human trafficking and human smuggling surging? So smuggling is definitely, as people are crossing over and over and over and repeatedly being expelled and then trying again and then being expelled and then trying again, that definitely creates business for the smugglers. Trafficking, I don't have as clear an answer on trafficking, but we know that the protections for children arriving at the border are designed to prevent them from being trafficked. So that could very well be happening now that they're just being expelled to their home countries. Let's see. You mentioned CBP is testing migrants for COVID prior to returning them to home country. Are they testing them at any other point and using those results to release detainees to ORR/on-own recognizance? So I think with that, it seems like, so the story from the ProPublica and the Texas Tribune was that children are being tested for COVID and then they're being sent back only if they test negative. I don't believe that there's, large-scale testing of people who are arriving at the border. There could be, but there's just very little transparency in that process. We don't really know, it's very hard to know what's happening. So I don't think there's, large-scale testing of people other than of children. But they could very easily just, take people in, sort of keep them in a safe environment while their claim is being processed, and then test them, and then release them or quarantine them. So there's definitely a safe way to do it. there's a way to do it that keeps people safe and upholds their human rights at the same time. Um, let's see. There was a question about the number of people in MPP in El Paso. So we have 19,625 people. That is the number of people who've been in El Paso who've ever been in MPP. So that's whether, people who are currently living in Juárez and proceeding with their case, people who decided to go back home and, just sort of gave up their case, people who, maybe they, so that's kind of the number of everyone who's ever been in MPP in El Paso, no matter where they are now. There's people living in Juárez in private housing or in shelters, people who've gone home, people who've just disappeared, maybe some people who've been able to reunite with family in the US. And then, Vicky, this might be a question for you. It's not specifically related to the regulations, but there's a question about, can a class action be built in light of the ruling on the Honduran child facing expulsion?
Yeah, I haven't even read that decision, so I'm a little hesitant to answer that. I mean, there's always a strategic decision about whether to bring a class action or not, as the Supreme Court has been more skeptical, I think, about class actions than they used to be. And I think in some situations, if there's if the claim is very fact specific about why a particular person shouldn't be sent back, it can make it difficult, I think, to make a class, or at least I think the argument the government would make is that, you can't say that nobody can ever be subjected to this. And so I think, I guess the short answer is maybe, but I think class actions are not the sort of panacea that we hope that they would be for everything, and that sometimes there are more dangers in bringing a class action, because the flip side is, if you bring a class action and you lose, then everybody's out of luck. Future litigation.
Yeah. All right, I think we'll do 2 more questions and then we can jump off. So are ICE agents and healthcare workers in the detention centers also becoming COVID-19 positive? So one concern definitely about ICE detention is that the employees, so there's, ICE employees as well as contractors, judges, attorneys, even though the courts have been closed, but there's a lot of people who are coming in and out on a daily basis and then going home to their families. And so it's definitely a concern that, that outbreak within ICE detention is putting the people there in really poor conditions and endangering their lives, but then also that could spread to the broader community and become like just a big seed of an outbreak. And then question about the minors that have been found recently in hotels. So there was this story from the Associated Press about how minors and some families, I believe, were being held in Hampton Inn and Suites hotels in McAllen, Phoenix, and El Paso. It does look like a group of those families or those people, children, were able to be, paroled into the US, or not paroled, but released to ORR to be placed in shelter. So there was a group of people who, when this came to light, there was an outrage and they were able to actually be put into the appropriate process. But the fact is that there's still a lot of children being turned back and expelled rapidly. So I think that that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you all so much again for joining us, and thank you so much, Vicki. We really, really appreciate you and clinic's work.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Bye-bye.